Everybody, welcome to this Excalibur training session on everything you need to know about SEND. If you don't know me, my name is Kate Hinks and I am the Trust Head of SEND. So I work across primaries and secondaries supporting everything there is to do with SEND. Now allow me to share my screen now and hopefully everybody can see that. So this training is called Everything You Need to Know About SEND, and it's really going to lay the groundwork and set the building blocks of SEND knowledge. So whether you are an early careers teacher, whether you are a new TA, whether you've been teaching for a long time and just want to make sure you've got the fundamentals right, whatever the reason is, this presentation should tell you everything that you need to know about SEND. So let's start at the beginning. What does SEND stand for? Well, it stands for Special Educational Needs and Disabilities. Sometimes you might hear it just called Special Educational Needs, SEN, but we've added that D on now, and so you might hear the term SEN, SEND, or SEN or SEND. Before we go into much more detail, I just want to give you a quick history around SEN. Because it's changed a lot over the last 200 years, but it's really important to know where it came from. So 200 years ago, we had language referring to SEN such as lunacy, idiots, retardation, feeble-minded, all sorts of very negative terms. That's important to be aware that SEN has developed from this model of deficiency. So this view that there is something wrong with children who have these sorts of needs. Now, obviously, this is something that we don't believe anymore. We do not believe that children with SEN are, regular children, but with something missing or some kind of additional problem. Instead, we just understand that everybody is diverse, everybody is different, and that some children need extra support. They have special needs. Now, interestingly enough, there's quite a campaign at the moment to get rid of this term special as well. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see whether or not that changes over time. But yeah, just a little bit of history there about where SEN sort of has come from. So what actually qualifies as a SEND? What is a special educational needs? Now, if I go back a slide, you can see that towards the end there, in 2015, there was a special educational needs code of practice released. And very recently, there's been an improvement plan to that, which I'll mention later. But this code of practice is still our sort of legal guide to SEND. And within the code of practice, it defines SEND as a child or young person who has a learning difficulty which calls for special provision to be made for him or her. So it's that special provision. And sometimes we use the phrase, they need something different from or additional to their peers. So something extra to enable them to engage in education. And what's really key, we want as many children as possible to be able to engage in an inclusive education. And that's why we have this SEND register so that we can ensure that children can engage. They might just need something additional in order to enable them to do so. So when we then break down special educational needs, we can put those needs into 4 categories. So when a learner is identified as having SEND, it will need to go into one of these categories. That need will need to be placed. So they are cognition and learning, social, emotional, mental health, communication, interaction, and sensory or physical needs. And every child will need to fit into one of these. Again, that's as per the code of practice. So let's break these down a little bit further. So cognition and learning needs, if a child has cognition and learning needs, they may struggle with reading or writing, they may struggle with numeracy, they may struggle with comprehension, any kind of working skills, so sequencing, inference, coherence, it might be working memory, or any other kind of issues with their executive functioning. Now, this might mean that they also have a diagnosis, something like dyslexia, dyscalculia, global delay, and you may see these terms MLD, moderate learning difficulty, or SLD, specific learning difficulties. Now, those are starting to go out of fashion a little bit now, those two terms, but they used to be used quite a lot. But as I want to make clear, the key is that they have a need relating to their cognitive and their learning capacity. So it doesn't matter whether or not they have that diagnosis. If the need is present, then they can go onto the SEND register. So that's cognition and learning. Social, emotional, and mental health. It's a very interesting one. So pupils with SEMH might have struggles with their concentration. They might have difficulties with their mood. It might be their behaviour. That's often what you tend to see. It could be their social interaction, or it could be their relationships. And they may have a diagnosis relating to anxiety, depression. They might have experienced trauma, maybe ADHD, maybe they have an eating disorder. But again, they don't need to have any sort of diagnosis. They just need to display that the need is there. If we move on to communication interaction needs, these broadly cover the diagnoses of autism and developmental language delay. But a child would struggle, as we're probably aware. It's very difficult in this current climate to get a diagnosis of autism or to see a specialist to diagnose something like a developmental language delay. So if we are aware that they have a need relating to their attention and listening, maybe to their understanding of the spoken language, maybe in their own speech, maybe in their social skills, their emotional regulation, then they could go on the SEND register under the communication and interaction needs heading. And then finally, this one tends to be more cut and dry. So you tend to find that the child will have the need relating to sight, hearing, mobility or health, and they will probably have some sort of a diagnosis as well, be that partially sighted, maybe cerebral palsy or some other kind of a medical condition that impacts on their ability to kind of operate around school. So those are the 4 areas of need, and it can be quite complex sometimes. Some children's needs might present in various categories. For example, I don't know if you noticed, but autism is a communication interaction need, but ADHD is an SEMH need. And actually, a lot of children have what's called a comorbid diagnosis, so they will fit into both of those areas of need. So it can be quite complex as to where you put them, but generally those broad areas of needs should catch all children that need to be on the SEND register. So once a child is on the SEND register, what do we do? Well, the real key is that early intervention and that early identification. So once we've recognised, yes, there is a need here, then we want to take some positive action. We want to do something about that. So once identified, as I said, they go onto the SEND register, which is managed by the SENCO, and the parents would be informed, the teacher would know, or the teachers. The learner may, if they have significant need, they might require an EHCP, and we'll talk about that in a minute. If they have an EHCP, you'll notice an E code on SIMS or Bromcom or whatever you use. But if they're not, if they don't warrant an EHCP, they will be on what's called SEND support, and they will get a K code on your register. Once they're on that register, whether they've got an E or a K, they will need to receive what's called the graduated response, or the assess, plan, do, review cycle, ADPR cycle. Again, I will move on and talk about that a little bit in a moment. But then if their needs are so severe that they cannot be met in a mainstream school, and if they have an EHCP, then it's possible that they might need to seek an alternative provision, or a resource base or some sort of special school. But as you're probably aware, those sorts of placements are really, really hard to come by. So we have to, as much as we can, as teachers, to meet their needs within the mainstream context. So I mentioned EHCPs. What is an EHCP? Well, it stands for an Education, Health and Care Plan. And the idea, it was brought in with the 2015 Code of Practice that I mentioned before, and it replaced the previous statements. We used to have statements of educational need. Now we have care plans. And the idea is that where statements were purely managed by the school, an education, health and care plan also involves healthcare, and it also involves social care. Now, what you generally find is the education school tends to be the one that manages it. Technically, that document is held and processed by the local authority, but again, it tends to be more education that takes the main responsibility for that document. Now, according to the government SEND Code of Practice, the EHCP should put the views and the voice of the parent and child at the very, very centre. That's really, really important that that document holds that information at the centre. It should describe what the needs is. And this is what's really challenging, because it's hard not to fall back into that deficit model that I mentioned right at the very start, with all that kind of complex and negative and loaded language. So quite often you can read HCPs that will just list off everything that's wrong with the child, and that's really really quite hard, particularly for the parents and the child involved. So we try and sort of balance the strengths as well as the differences that that child is experiencing. It will also establish the desired outcomes. So what is it we want this child to be able to achieve? Where do we want to get them? What is our, our targets and our outcomes for this child? And they will mostly probably be education based, but there might be some health ones in there, or some social care ones as well. It will also direct what we call the provision. So if those are our desired outcomes, what is going to happen? Is this child going to have ELSA? Are they going to have TA support? Are they going to have specialist interventions? What is the provision that's going to be in place for that child in order to meet those outcomes that we've set? And this will be reviewed annually by the SENCO, but very often with teacher support. So if you have children with EHCPs in your classroom, and I know there are some trusts, some schools in the trust that will only have 1 or 2 children in the whole school with EHCPs, and there are some that have huge amounts of children with EHCPs in. But if you are a teacher in the trust, you need to know whether or not you have children with EHCPs in your class. And if you do, you need to be aware of the outcomes. So what is it that this child is trying to work towards? You need to be aware of what the provision is. Now, some of that won't be relevant to you as their class teacher, particularly if you're in secondary school and you see them for an hour a fortnight. If they're getting weekly ELSA, that might not be relevant to you, but you should still be aware that it's happening. And that will be your guide to helping, to being one of the team around that child that helps to remove the barriers that are caused by their SEND. You will also be expected to feed into the review process in some way. Now, if you are a primary school teacher, this might mean that you go to the review with the SENCO and you meet with the parents and possibly the local authority, and you discuss the progress and that child's needs. But if you are a secondary teacher, and as I said, you might only see that child once a week, then maybe you would give some written feedback at how they're getting on specifically in your lesson related to their outcomes to the SENCO, so that they can have that and feedback on it. It's just worth mentioning, I said that this year some new a good government plan had come out about changing how SEND is done, and it's very possible that's actually going to change how our EHCPs are going to look, and hopefully it's going to make them more manageable and improve the quality. So just something to be aware of and look out for. So I mentioned that if a child doesn't have an EHCP, then they receive the graduated SEND or ADPR cycle. Sorry, actually, if they have an HCP as well, they still have part of this cycle. So every child on the SEND register will have this cycle in place for them. But if they don't have an EHCP, this will be the only thing that they have in place, and this will be their SEND support. So this is what the government in that code of practice has described as being SEND support, how we support children with SEN. So we assess their needs, we plan the provision that's going to meet their needs, we carry that provision out, and we review it regularly. So in more detail, we would be putting in high quality teaching, and we would have whole school systems in place for assessing how they're getting on with and whether they're making progress. And if they're not making progress, then we would start assessing the reasons for that. Now, that could be discussions with class teacher and SENCO. That assessment could be discussions with parents, discussions with the child themselves. It could be some kind of formal assessing, so putting them through different testing, and SENCOs have a whole raft of different assessments up their sleeve that can assess them against different SEN criteria. It might be getting in an educational psychologist, a speech and language therapist, someone from the local authority SEN team, but that some sort of assessment will need to take place in order to really break down, well, actually, what are the barriers? Why is this child experiencing difficulties, not making progress across the curriculum? And once we know what those barriers are, we can start to plan the provision for it. Is it a literacy related barrier? Shall we put in some lexia or some additional phonics? Is it an interaction based difficulty? Do we need some circle of friends or some social skills groups? So we would put the provision into a plan, and we'll have a look at what those plans might look like in a moment. And then, of course, we carry it out. We deliver the intervention, we adjust our approaches, whatever it is that we might need to do. We do that on a daily basis. And of course, we assess it constantly. We're always reviewing as professionals, we're always reflecting. But 3 times a year, we need to formally review that as well. So we need to look more formally about what progress they're making, and we need to involve parents and the child in this process. And of course, once we've reviewed it, we might need to reassess, what has changed since that review, or in that review, what's been different, and do we need to adjust the plan, and do we need to change what we're doing? And that's why it's, it's a continual cycle that goes on and on and on, with the idea that that child continues to improve and make progress. And it might be that at one stage we review it and we say, actually, do you know what, now they don't need anything additional to or different from the rest of their peers, and actually we can move them off the SEN register and just monitor them in the future. So I talked about that plan stage. So every child on the SEN register needs to have a personal plan for them about how their needs are going to be addressed. If they need something additional to or different from their peers, what is that? What does it look like? And how are we going to plan it out? So there are loads of different terms for these plans. They might be called individual support plans. They might be called pupil passports. They might be called pupil profiles, support and achievement plans, individual education plans. There are so many different terms that I've heard from them, but every child needs to have some kind of document that plans their provision. And these are really important. They're a snapshot of the child that's, really crucial. If you're in a primary school and you know that child really well, it might not seem necessary to have this snapshot. But what about when you go sick and that supply teacher needs to come in and they need to get a really quick view of how they need to handle this child and what approaches and what support that child needs in place. Similarly, if you are that Key Stage 3 dance teacher, for example, that only sees that child once a fortnight, this document is going to be really important for you. You're not going to have, lots and lots of time to get to know this child and, trial and error what might work with them. So you're going to need a plan that's really clear about what you need to do. So this is a nice example of a secondary plan. You can see that in the I would like you to know section, it's capturing the student voice. So it's got their interests, what they like, their strengths. But it also talks about what are the differences that they have compared to their peers. So this child suffers from high anxiety and has some sensory difficulties surrounding noise and other things. And then we would have a list of the strategies. So what actually can we do? So she will need extra time, she will need her name being used, and so forth. We can also have a sort of what doesn't work for me. So if there's anything in particular to avoid, that can be really helpful. Here's an example of a primary one-page profile. What I really like about this one, again, it lists the strengths at the top, and then it says areas of difference that impact my learning, and you can see they're numbered. So the first one, this child finds it difficult to sit on the carpet. That's his number 1 difference. And if you look at his number 1 strategy, it's linked to his number 1 difference. So if he finds it hard to sit still on the carpet, what are we going to do about it? Well, we're going to give him sand timers. That's where you might want to put fiddle toys or wobble cushions. All of those strategies that are used to help a child sit on the carpet, they can be directly carried across. And you can use this, I've given this as an example of a primary profile, but you can use that for a secondary child too. It's whatever works for your context. But as long as there is something in place that maps out that provision, what is that child going to receive that's additional to or different from their peers in order to meet their needs. And as well as a plan for provision, it's also really important that we have clear desired outcomes for pupils with SEND. So if they're on the register, there is obviously a need that's getting in the way of their progress, and we need to tackle that need with a clear target of where we're going to get them. Now, these are not academic attainment targets. So this isn't going to be something like they will pass their phonics screener by the end of year 2, or they will get 4s in all of their GCSEs at the end of year 11. They're not attainment targets. What instead we need to be looking at is, why is this child potentially not going to get their phonics at the end of year 2? What is it that we need to tackle? Is it because they struggle to sit still on the carpet during phonics and they need support, as I just mentioned previously? Is it that they're struggling to interpret the phonics, and do they need some intensive speech and language support? Are they not going to get their GCSEs at grade 4 and above because of their attendance, and they need some specific support for that? So it becomes really targeted on the area of that child's need. They must be smart. It's tricky to get smart targets. I know everybody has heard about smart targets. Everybody knows what it stands for, but it's really important, particularly that these targets are time bound. So I often go in and I see relevant targets, relevant outcomes, but they're just not time bound. So if you look at example number 3, that's a really clear smart target. So Khadija will be able to name numbers 1 to 10 by the end of the year. So we know that she needs to name the numbers. So it's not reciting them, it's not rattling them off, but naming them, maybe pointing to them could make that target even more smart. So we said Khadija will be able to accurately identify numbers 1 to 10, and we know when. It's by the end of that year. And again, the one below, Connor will be able to ask for an adult to help him with the subjects he finds challenging at least once per lesson. And again, you can make that even better by saying by the end of Easter. So it makes them really trackable, really monitorable, because these are going to be how you show that that child is making progress. So it might well be that Connor and Khadija, they're not seeming to make any academic progress. You know, they're staying at working below constantly. And, you know, it looks in our data as if we're not driving them forwards, but actually when we're assessing their outcomes, that's when we can evidence, yes, okay, they're still working below, but actually Khadija could only name numbers 1 to 5. And this term she's been able to name numbers 1 to 10. So she is making progress. Ideally, these outcomes need to be co-produced with the parent and the child in mind. The child is much more likely to make progress towards these outcomes if they've been involved in setting them and if they're important to that child. And as I mentioned before, they must be reviewed 3 times a year. Now, the system that I recommend putting in place, and you know, discuss this more with your SENCo to find out your own what your own system looks like, but this is the one that I recommend, is having this sheet, which I call the outcomes tracker sheet, or the outcome tracking grid. As you can see on the left hand side, you would put those outcomes in. Now I've left space for 3 outcomes. Realistically, particularly if you have a high number of SEND children in your class, you are not going to be able to remember any more than 3 outcomes. Even 3 is a push. And please don't feel like you need to find 3 outcomes for your pupils. If there is one thing that more than anything impacts on their learning, then just give them 1 outcome related to that one area. So by the end of the year, or by the end of October, or within the next 6 weeks, this child will be able to do this. So that's what goes in that kind of left-hand column, is what is the outcome. In the next one along, the second from the left, you talk about the provision. Well, if we want them, if the most important thing is that they can, you know, increase their concentration on the carpet, then what are we going to put in place? What is that provision? It's going to be fiddle toys, it's going to be sand timers, it's going to be visual cues, regular reminders, reward systems. That's the provision that you put in place in order to meet that outcome. And then you can see the last 3 columns are just a comment. So it might be actually that they totally surpass that outcome. And in the autumn term comment, you say something like, actually, yeah, they've really increased their ability to concentrate on the carpet. And now what we need is for them to be able to increase how long they can sit and do desk-based learning. And, you know, you link your comments to the original outcome, but you might set a new outcome related to that need in that comment box. Or you might say, actually, there's limited progress and this outcome needs to stay, or there has been progress, but it's still relevant. And what then happens is, on this one sheet over the year, you get this narrative of the child's progress. You can see where they're going to. And I know some other systems, you might have a kind of one sheet for every review, but I like this because it's quite brief to fill in. It doesn't take lots and lots of time, but it does need some thought to go into it, to be carried out carefully. And it's a narrative of that child's progress all on one sheet. So that's the sort of systems around SEND. But let's have a little look more about what teachers need to do. So we have certain responsibilities and they are enshrined in law. So they're legal obligations and we can be held to these obligations. So in the Equalities Act from 2010, it says very clearly that schools have to make reasonable adjustments in order to include children. Now, that term is quite tricky because what does a reasonable adjustment mean? Does it mean something relatively straightforward, like a laptop, rather than doing handwriting? Or does it mean something much, much more complicated? And the definition of reasonable will vary depending on the school and the resources that you have in place. But it's really important to know that we do have to be able to evidence that we've made a reasonable adjustment. In the SEND Code of Practice, the 2015 document that's relevant today, section 6.36, it's really, really clear. It says teachers, and I've added in brackets there, not SENCOs, not teaching assistants, not senior leadership, but teachers are the ones that are accountable for the progress and development of every pupil in their class. And that's where we get that kind of idea of every teacher is a teacher of SEN. So even if you know that you've got a pupil in your class that regularly goes off and sees a SENCO or sees their ELSA, you're still in charge of that pupil's learning and that pupil's development. Teacher Standard 5 in the Teacher Standards doc is really clear as well. It says that all teachers must have the ability to adapt their teaching. So in order to be a successful teacher, you must be regularly adapting and responding to strengths and needs of your pupils. So particularly, you're going to need to know how to differentiate appropriately. We'll look at that term differentiation in a moment. But we need to have secure understanding of how factors can inhibit people's ability to learn. We need to be able to demonstrate awareness of physical, social and intellectual development of children and how to adapt our teaching to support their education at these different stages of development. And we need to have a really clear understanding of all of our pupils' needs, including those with SEND, and those of high ability, and those with EAL, and those with a disability, and that we need to be able to evaluate our distinctive approaches in order to engage and support them. So what that means is that we are being expected legally to make differences in our practice. Our lessons cannot be a one-size-fits-all. So in practice, what do we need to do? We need to know these learners well. That's really, really important. As best we can, we need to build relationships with them. Now, that is going to be difficult if you have a Key Stage 3 class with SEN learners in, but you only see them once a fortnight. That is, of course, going to be tough. So I would recommend that you read their paperwork really, really clearly, that you speak to professionals who know them well. So that might be the SENCO, but maybe, again, if you see them once a fortnight in a secondary school, maybe go and speak to their English teacher, their maths teacher, someone who sees them 4 times a week might be able to give you sort of a better developed picture. Speak to their parents and any other professionals that they might be involved with. It's important that you contribute to that assess, plan, do, review, particularly the do element. If there's a clear plan of what that child should be receiving to support their needs, then you need to be carrying that out. It's so important that you plan and teach good lessons, that you make those reasonable adjustments. And also it's a real mindset thing. So you might get a child that arrives and you've never known anybody with similar needs, and we need to be open-minded. We need to be committed to the idea of inclusion, and that everybody is welcome in our classrooms, and that we need to adjust what we do in order to include them. Because it's really important that SEN pupils are supported to keep up with their peers. As I said, we have this model of inclusion in the UK where we want children to be in mainstream education as much as possible, but we want our schools to be inclusive as well. And it very much used to be that some pupils went and saw the SENCO or went to the SEND faculty, and sort of different things happened in the SEND faculty, but they didn't really impact on the rest of the school. And that's not the model anymore. We want what's happening for SEND children to be woven through everything that happens in a school. So those targeted interventions that happen outside of your classroom, that they can be really, really powerful, really impactful, but they must be targeted. They must be high quality, they must be really well structured and carefully monitored by the teacher to add value to what's happening in the classroom. So if they're stepping out of your classroom to do some social skills, it's important that you're aware of what that looks like, what's involved, how you can engage and support that child when they come back into the room. And of course, quality first, adaptive teaching is the absolute key to unlock their progress. Because we used to use this term differentiation, and certainly when I was teacher training, we used to think of differentiation as meaning essentially needing 3 strands, or at least 3 strands, to our lesson plans. So having low outcomes, low objectives that everybody meets, and then some sort of medium objectives that most children will meet, and then some really high objectives that only some children will meet. And what this does is it actually puts a ceiling there for learners with SEND, which, it is morally questionable. If we don't allow children access to our highest ambitions, then we are, guilty of holding them back. And the example that you may have heard me give already is that I've been into a lesson where most of the class were labelling the features of a medieval castle, but some pupils with SEN were colouring the castle in. Now, although they're all engaging with castles, the level of understanding that those higher ability pupils are going to get is way higher than those SEN pupils with SEN. So actually, instead, we want to scaffold that and go, how can we support learners to be able to label the castle and to know that same information? Of course, some pupils are going to need a more personalised approach. And the general rule of thumb is that this should only be given if they're working 2 years or more below their peers, and only with the agreement of the SENCO and SLT, who will, of course, have consulted with the parents. All other pupils up to 2 years behind their peers require adaptive teaching and that keep up rather than that catch up approach. So I am going to do another session later on in this term on the daily 5 for SEND, because when I say adaptive teaching and scaffolding, this is the real key to including children in our classroom. But just to give you some awareness now, the EEF, the Education Endowment Foundation, put together some research of the strategies that really work for SEND pupils in the classroom. And they found that when teachers are really explicit with their instruction, and being explicit means dual coding, so using images as well as the verbal word. It means chunking information, giving one instruction at a time, being careful with their spoken language. Anything that makes the learning incredibly explicit benefits learners with SEND. Using cognitive and metacognitive strategies. So that's thinking about how much thinking that child is going to be doing and limiting the cognitive load. It's about getting children to think about how they learn and how they solve problems, and really getting them to reflect on that process. Scaffolding, this is when we have high expectations, high learning objectives, but we change the level of support. So if we want, for example, all of our children to write a story, we might give some of our children just a blank page, whereas with some others, we might first give them a story map for them to develop, or some sentence starters for them to use. Flexible grouping, that's when we certainly don't have one SEND table that all of your weaker or lower ability children sit at, because that can create stigma. Instead, we use how we group the children flexibly. So it might be at times that we group them by performance, but at other times we might be grouping them as mixed ability children, so they really change and they can kind of learn from each other. It might be that we put them in partners based on their attitude to learning rather than their actual performance. So it's being really flexible with how we group up the children. And then finally, using technology, any kind of instructional app or supportive technology, so visualizers, word processors, apps like Timetable, Rockstar and Lexia, all of those sorts of technology-based programs can really support learners with SEND. But as I say, I'm going to go later on this year. I'll show the flyer with the dates on it in a moment, but later on this year, I will do a specific video session on the Daily 5 that you'll be able to access. The great thing about them, as I said, the research shows that these 5 approaches add the maximum value. The research shows that if you use those approaches, they're going to make quicker progress than if you don't. But you're also probably doing them already. Explicit instruction, for example, you'll find you're doing already. Flexible grouping, you might well be doing already. So they shouldn't be too difficult to develop. And actually, if you're not doing one of them, it just takes a little bit of extra thought. It's not, you don't need to throw all your planning out of the window and start again from scratch. It just needs a little bit of thought about how you're going to adapt your practice. And also they will benefit all learners, your highest ability learner, your learner with SEN, your learner that's just a bit tired that morning is going to benefit from these daily 5. So really important that you're aware of them and that you're using them regularly for everybody in your classroom. So finally, that's everything you need to know about SEND in a very, very quick nutshell. But it's important to note that in March, the government came up with the SENDAP plan, or the Special Educational Needs and Disabilities and Alternative Provision plan, which is going to change things. The aim of this plan is to skill up schools and make them even more inclusive places than they already are. So it's very possible that some of the information I've given you today is going to change over time. This plan so far very much sets out the aims and how the government wants to make changes, but those changes haven't come into to consideration yet. I've put some links there that you can use should you want to learn more about the SEND and an alternative provision plan. But as and when we know more, you will hear more from me. And that's it from me. Thank you so much for watching this video. As I said, there are going to be lots more of these sessions. I'm going to do 10 of these sessions this academic year and hopefully more next academic year. They will all be uploaded onto the EAT Professional Learning Hub, the CPD Hub on SharePoint. So please do go and watch the videos back. I'll also try and upload the PowerPoints there. But if you have any questions at all based on this training or anything else SEND related, either speak to your SENCO or by all means email me on kate.hinks@excalibur.org.uk. Thank you so much.